I was in IT before. I was customer services. I was in customer services and IT and operations and things like that. And I came out of that all sorts of different things and talked about that on a previous session, which you can see in the that's a little YouTube in joke. Yeah, so I along the journey, when I was in that sort of place of basically, wow, there's other stuff in the world that I haven't experienced, and that I wanted to do something more meaningful. So I'd been working in IT and it really wasn't meaningful at all. So I wanted to do something more meaningful with my life. And so because of that, I just started volunteering at places and so on. And I met somebody who'd been in prison, and through him, I got involved in the recovery community. So I met lots and lots of people with addictions, and they'd been in prison and they'd had lots of traumas in their life. And I loved them. I thought they were amazing, seeing people being truly amazing. And they didn't really know that they were amazing. And just, I thought that I wanted to do that work, and I knew that I wanted to help, but no one really wanted to pay me for it. So the people that I was working with couldn't afford it, and I wouldn't have expected them to pay. And then the people that could afford it, like addiction agencies and places like that, they didn't want to know, because they've got their set ways of doing things that they believe in, and they didn't want to know about this new paradigm. Back then, back in the day in 2014, I guess that I didn't really know how to talk about it either. So, I would go to meetings in London with, I won't mention their names, but addiction agencies, and they'd just frown at me and think, what's she talking about? How do people change? Well, I don't really know how they change. I just talk to them and they change. And I was very fortunate because I got introduced to somebody at the prison, and I stalked him. So I found out that he was going to an event, and I went to that event and started talking to him and saying, it'd be really good to come along and tell you about this thing. I was sort of a bit shocked by that. And I was doing all sorts of other work at the time. So that included stuff in envelopes, but occasionally people would hire me as like a coach to help them with, if they did events, I'd be their coach person that would go around and talk to people. And one day I was at this event, which is in a very posh hotel in Birmingham, and there was all these sort of business people, and we were all dressed up and everything. And then the next day I was sitting in this grubby prison reception area, and looked very scary, and you weren't allowed to go through there was 3 doors, and you weren't allowed to go through the doors and things. And I remember sitting there thinking, I want to come and work here. So I never thought I want to work in prisons and made that happen. I really just followed what, one foot in front of the other, and that led to that. So I had an interview with that I'd stalked, and the head of NHS at the time. There's a bit of a funny story, actually. I was just writing in my book earlier about this, and along with me, a guy that I'd been working with from the recovery community, and we'd had years and years and all sorts of things, and he was really seeing a lot, and feeling a lot more peaceful. And we went along, and we went through all these gates, great big gates that had to be locked and unlocked, and they clang as you go through them. And we went to this block, which we later found out it's called the healthcare block, and it's really nice, actually. There was nice seats and a little sink and somewhere for a drink, to the loo. So I said, oh, loo. So we left my colleague in the room with the other person. The person I was having the meeting with took me to the loo. I'm in the loo, and it was all a bit scary. I was a bit like, this is really prison, like this is really scary. And all the alarms went off. Now, in my mind, and I know now that this isn't true because I've been in there when alarms go off, but in my mind, it looked like all these really loud alarms went off, and doors came down, and officers came running around with guns, and it's seemed really, really scary. And there was a lot of running about, and somebody banged on the door and they said, get back in the room. And there was lots of shuffling about. The guy that I was meeting with said, when someone presses the panic alarm, basically the whole prison stops and everyone goes to the rescue. And if they can't sort the problem, then the tornado team come in, you know. So it's a really big deal. And so I was like, oh, okay, you know. So we went back to the room, and my colleague, we'll call him Will, my colleague Will, he said, you know that big green button on the wall, and there's like a big green panic button there? I said, and he said, is that the light switch? And he'd pressed the panic alarm. So obviously the guy that we were meeting went and stood down the tornado team and all of that. And I thought, wow, that's it, we've blown it. You know, basically the first day in prison and we've pressed the panic alarm and set up all these officers running around. And of course, you know, I was anxious as well. Anyway, we hadn't blown it. And quite by stroke of mind, the guy that was interviewing me, his name was Scott, he had read a book by Richard Carlson called Stop Thinking and Start Living. And Richard Carlson. So he could hear that this was similar to something that he'd read. And he said, I think I know what this is, and so on. But again, he kept saying, well, how does it work? And why do people change? And I didn't really know how to explain all of that. But by the seat of our pants, he decided that he'd give it a go. And he said, oh, you know, come and do a pilot. And another little part to that story, and this is, I tell you this because this is how naive I was. So up until now, I'd been doing it voluntary for 2 years. I'd experienced nobody wanted it. And although I'd run a business before, a project management business, I'd never been in this world, and there's no money in this world. And he said, oh, how much is it? And I just didn't expect him to ask that question for some reason. 50 quid. And Will, you know, sort of kicked me under the table, but it was out my mouth, you know, and I lived 44 miles away from the prison. So a round trip would probably cost me that much to get there. But he said, you know, well, we'll do a proposal and we'll do a 12-week program. So I wrote a proposal, but it was 50 quid a session. So that sort of glossed over that little bit, and then sent it off. And I was, again, another bit of serendipity. He passed that proposal on to the local commissioner, the local council commissioner, and the commissioner really liked it. And he got it because he wrote an email to me, and he sort of understood that people change because they realize that they're the thinker, and that's what he got. And as it happens, there was an underspend in the budget. They'd closed a prison, and they wanted me to do a 12-month pilot. So they came back to say, you know, the mental health team love it, but the psychologists not so much. So could you write a business case? And I said, yeah, of course, yeah. You do a 12-month pilot. And then I came off the phone and thought, I wonder what a business case is. So I didn't even know what a business case was. But I researched it and found out what it was. And basically I had to write a big paper that explains how you're going to do, what you're going to do, what resources you need, what research there was. And again, you know, there's lots of luck in this story. Lots of hard work and metal, but lots of luck as well. There wasn't very much research at the time. So some of the OGs that used to like deliver principals work will openly admit they did not like research and never really wanted to do it. And in fact, there's some room somewhere with piles and piles of paper that they did take scores and things, but they never used it. So there was very little research. I learned a lot by trying to find it, and I actually made a lot of connections by trying to do that. And there's another little side story, which I'll just quickly tell you, which is that there's a guy in the community called Jack Pranksky. He's written a few books. One of his books is Somebody Should Have Told Us, which is an excellent book. I highly recommend it. And it was one of the first books that I'd read, and I was really impacted by it. And so he's American, and I'd gone along to London to see him talk and get him to sign my book. He saw one day on LinkedIn, which is like a networking platform, that he wanted to turn his book Modelo, which is about a community project that had massively transformed due to the 3 principles, or health realization as it was called then. He wanted to turn it into a film, and he was looking for a filmmaker, and I knew a filmmaker, so I introduced him to a filmmaker. And then he ended up saying to me, well, I'm coming to England, actually doing a European tour. I could come and see you, which I was totally shocked at, because I didn't know this guy from Adam, and there he was, like, I come and see you. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, you could stay with us if you like. And he went, yes, please. So Dr. Jack Branksky, turns up in Birmingham one day where we lived, and we went for coffee, and he ended up staying the night. Went to his little room. Rob, my fiance at the time, said, oh, and where do you know him from? And I said, well, I don't really. He said, so we've got some strange bloke staying in the spare bedroom. Anyway, later on, when I got when they asked me to write the prison business case, I got back in touch with Jack and said, oh, guess what? And he said, well, after him, my terrible accent again, he said, Jacqueline, do you want to put your name on the map? I said, what do you mean? And he said, make it a research project, because that's what the community need. And so because of him, I then got in touch with another wonderful research lady called Linda Ramus and Tom Kelly, Professor Tom Kelly. And we made that business case into a research project. And that's how I ended up co-authoring research paper. And we've obviously developed 2 more since then. But without all of that happening, when I look now, I think, how did all that happen? There wasn't really, it was never that I went, oh yeah, right, I'm doing this, and I was focused and I got on and did it. I just did what was next in front of me, what turned up, and I feel that I was guided, each step of the way. And there was lots of hard work, but I was guided each step of the way. So